Hello everybody, it's time for another week in review, this time of the deck's 2nd Guard Tankovy Corps and 352nd Infantry, suggested a few weeks ago by Flick17 in the comment section of one of my videos. Bear in mind that if you'd like to see any specific decks covered in this series, leave them in the comments below and we'll either route you to where those already exist or put them at the end of the list in chronological order. Quick disclaimer before I get into the heart of the video, this has been recorded a few weeks ahead of time, as during the time of the release of this video I will be on vacation, and to not miss an upload I've decided to pre-record instead of just postpone. Because of this, it is altogether possible that Eugen has launched a patch or something that will vastly change the outcome of what these divisions can and will bring in, and in that case I will promptly issue a redo whenever I get back into town and settle down and whatnot. So rest assured, if you're watching this video and you're like, 2nd Guard doesn't get T-34s anymore, or some other more likely, less extreme example, that I will get back and immediately set to work on figuring out how to build a deck in the new meta. With all that out of the way, let's jump right into the decks, starting with 2nd Guard Tankovy Corps. Now, at the beginning of the week, I sort of built this deck with past knowledge of hundreds of times trying to play this deck before. In fact, this is kind of a modified version of a deck that I've had for a very long time. The Recon tab sports 4 cards of available Razvedka, which is hilarious being that it only has 3 available slots to put them in, and all these slots are quite expensive. Because of the expense, I brought in just the 1 card of Razvedka in Phase A and intended to use them as sort of my Panzerschreck teams as per usual. In the Infantry tab, I went really light in Phase A with just 1 card of Guardia DP. This was interesting to use, but I'll get onto that when I get into the gameplay section. In Phase B, I brought in 1 card of Guardia, normal, and a Phase B card of Tanko Desantniki in the M2A1 half-track transport. I also sprung for the Tanko Komrodi coming in the Dushka transport, as this deck does not have any snipers available in the Recon tab, so I figured bringing in a sniper leader might be a way to subvert this. However, I found that due to the price of the unit, I oftentimes did not bring in the Tanko Komrodi. In Phase C, I brought in a card of just regular Guardia also. Over in the Tank tab, I started it off with a Phase A card of T-34-76 Komrodis, a Phase A 1-star card of T-34-85 1943s, and a 1-star card of T-34-85 1944s. Now, aside from the usual reasoning of why I bring things in at 1-star, being that you don't lose that many of them, the T-34 is an extremely special example. With the way the T-34-85 1944 works, I feel it is imperative that it hits each and every shot. It's only 90 points, and it's the heaviest tank that you have in this deck if you exclude the ISU 152, which I do. On top of that, it's your only way to deal with tanks in a sort of straight-on engagement, disregarding anti-tank guns. It's not only nice to have these guys with the added accuracy of 1 additional star, but at the same time I feel it's necessary for this deck. If the T-34-1944 misses too many shots in a row, then it might just be the end of your advance. These things are notoriously squishy, and enemy Panthers and Tigers will have no problem peeling through them if you mismanage them. With that in mind, I set out to remove as much RNG as possible from this division by upvetting them as much as I could, and keeping them around command as much as possible. Throughout the week, though, through liberal use of fire toggling and excellent micromanaging, I found that these 1944s really overperform. Anything less than 1200 meters and they become a real danger for the Panther A or the Tiger E, mainly due to their insanely high fire toggling fire rate, but also because of the insane penetration on their APCR shell and the quite high damage on both of their shells combined. Being that I was mainly taking engagements at less than 1500 meters, it meant that both the APCR and the AP shell had a decent chance of penetrating any target that I'd be engaging, and oftentimes it was engaging its side armor for that target because of the ambush role that these play. Couple that with the fact that their reduced price means that you can put them on multiple fronts, incurring this sort of pincer maneuver that forces these side armor or back armor hits, and you have a very deadly combination on your hands. In previous iterations of this deck, I've sought to take the 1943 out, as it's just the 1944 but 5 points cheaper and doesn't come with the APCR. Initially, I thought to remove these just to bring in more of the 1944s and supplement those with the T-34-76s. However, I think this is a flawed notion. While the 1943 does lack the APCR and thus some of the penetration and fire rate values that the 1944 has, it does still bring in a decent armament and still does shrug off a few hits from medium tanks at distance, so I feel it's still worth bringing in, especially because of the availability per card. Moving on though to Phase B, where I have the T-34-85 1943 and 1944, again both coming in at 1 star, and Phase C, where I brought in the T-34-76 1942, no stars, a T-34-85 Komrodi, and a T-34-85 1944 at 1 star again in Phase C. All in all, I didn't find I used this many of these tanks, and if I was to make any changes, other than the ones I'm going to show you here in a bit, I would bring in more of the 76s rather than the 85s. The 85s are excellent, don't get me wrong, but I found that I just didn't have enough points to bring them in any reasonable game, and on top of that, the 85s are kind of inconsistent units, making them a very painful loss if they ever go down to something that you deem should not have happened. The T-34-76 doesn't have this compunction, however, being that if you lose a T-34-76, it's just another medium tank that's been thrown away. It's not something that you're relying on to kill those heavier vehicles. Moving on to the support tab, I have AALGXouIAJgAKmcAAA coming in the WLA motorbike in Phase A Phase A card of the SG-43, and a Phase A OB-25 76.2mm infantry support gun, along with the Phase A commander. Now the Phase A commander in this deck is interesting, being that it costs fewer points than a typical combat unit does. However, it can't hide in buildings or forests quite as decently because it's a vehicle, so take it or leave it. I noticed with the advent of the recent Nemesis DLC, they've added a T-34-85 combat to the Phase C complement of this division, and I genuinely considered bringing this in, as that unit really overperforms for me in the 10th guard deck that it's currently also present in. However, I sort of leaned in toward having more command earlier rather than later in this deck, so that's another thing that you could potentially change based on playstyle. In Phase A, I round it all out with an ISU-152 and another card of that in Phase B. I don't bring in as many ISU-152s as you can, and I know that this is where I differ from a lot of people when building a second guard division. However, I find that the ISU-152 is the most upsetting unit I've ever used in any army. The 152 fires at a base 30% accuracy. Just 30%. It is so frustrating to use. I found that one instance throughout the week when I was playing this, I had sneaked one of these up on either side of a King Tiger, and I was so excited to jump out and ambush it. I watched as both tanks came out of their cover. The King Tiger swiveled and looked at one. I said, "Haha, I've got you now." The one staring at its face hits front armor. The one staring at its back whiffs the shot entirely. Both of them die before they even score a hit on the King Tiger, let alone a penetration. Because of this, I want to use as few of these units as humanly possible, and mainly use them as infantry support guns as much as I can. They'll do alright at 2-kilometer engagements with Panthers or Tigers, however, they'll eventually just get penetrated by those units and die anyway, as they really have no way to engage those units at range, which is ironic as the beast they were intended to slay was the Tiger, but I digress. In the anti-tank tab, I bring in a card of the PTS-41s in the WLA motorbike, a Phase A card of the M42 45mm in the DZ-HIP transport, and a Phase A and Phase B card of the ZIS-2s, both coming in the Studebaker transport. This is a fairly standard AT tab, and honestly, I don't know that there's anything I would change about this. The ZIS-2 is more than enough as a 57mm gun to help pin down those much larger targets. The M42 is an excellent option to kill enemy light vehicles, transports, score critical hits on heavy tanks, really anything you need, and the PTRS-41 is an excellent unit to have at the front of any engagement. Moving on to the air tab, I have a Phase A and Phase C card of the Zenart 37mm, both of them coming in the Dushka transport, and a Phase B card of the M17s, which I've come around on in a huge way. These guys are excellent for just posting up behind your T-34s, as they will dissuade most any bombing run that doesn't come in with sufficient numbers. The only drawback of the M17 is because of its reduced range, you have to have it much closer to the front than you would otherwise have to have, say, a 37mm or an M15 gun. This is another playstyle thing, as you could bring in other AA units. I think there was even another card of Zenart 37s that was available to bring in, and plenty more Dushka transports to bring them in on, but I went with the M17 and I think it was the right call. In the artillery tab, I opted out of bringing in the 76mm mortars in the form of the Su-76 because I just didn't want to bring in that many supply trucks in the already bloated support tab. I opted to bring in the WLA 37mm and a Phase A off-map carrier to get those early footholds TM, a Phase B card of the F-22s to use as counter battery, all coming in the supply truck transport, and a Phase C artillery commander just to round out that late game command structure, though I could see my way into dropping this. In the air tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Yak-1B Normandies that come in at 2 stars with 3 per card. I feel these are non-negotiable to bring in this deck. Being that you still get 3 per card at a forced 2-star veterancy, I just can't see a better unit that I would rather bring in instead of these. On top of all this, they're not terrible units in the sky, and typically outperform most enemy air superiority fighters just due to its added agility from those 2 stars. In phases B and C, I bring in variants of the PE-2 TAC-83 bombers, and these were mainly there just to take out targets that I otherwise couldn't with the T-34s, such as King Tigers, Ferdinands, Jagd Panthers. Anything with an 88 really is a problem. Moving on to my deck at the end of the week, you'll see that the infantry tab is the first thing that I changed, dropping the Tanko Komrodi that I admitted I wasn't bringing in quite often and bringing in the Gavardia Komrodi instead. These guys came in with just as many numbers, much cheaper, and at an earlier phase so that I could get better support onto my tanks. With that, I also dropped the T-34-76 Komrodi from Phase A in my tank tab and brought in the T-34-76 1943 instead. Practically the same vehicle, however, without the command stat, and I just had a little bit more in the way of cheaper options in the earlier phases. This meant that I had to use my Gavardia Komrodi to command my tanks or risk my commander oftentimes, but I found that this was definitely the way to go just because the T-34-76 tank commanders do not really survive all that well. Other than these 2 things, we don't really see a change in this division. I could see my way into dropping the ISU-152 card from Phase B and perhaps bringing it up to 1 star or dropping it all the way to Phase C, as these would both be viable options. I could also see myself dropping the Phase A card of the ISU-152 and moving that to a later phase, as in Phase A I had the option of the SG-43, the OB-25 76.2mm, and the ISU-152, all more or less doing the same goal for me. Second Guard is definitely an interesting beast. I find that it is completely worthless on an open field against any Axis armored division or stationary division, or really anything that has an AT gun heavier than a PaK-38. The T-34-85, while being excellent at close quarters combat or that mid-ranged engagements of about 1 kilometer, is absolutely awful at a 2 kilometer engagements against most anything that is heavier than a Panzer IV. They are fairly quick and traverse light forests fairly quickly because of this, and so they do very well on those sorts of mid-ranged areas where you might ambush around a forest or through a forest or support infantry in that same scenario. However, to that same end, you're kind of hampered there too. The infantry in this division are not only lacking in quantity, but also in quality. Other than the Tanko Desetniki, there's not much in this division that comes in an interesting way. You only have access to 1 card of Gavardia DP. The other 2 cards of Gavardia are nice and do add to your ability to cover more ground and defend that ground once you've taken it, but aren't going to do much else for you once you take things. The Razvedka in this deck were really kind of my star units, as they sort of capitalized on a lot of these mid-ranged engagements where people might try to rush a Tiger into a spot that they haven't adequately reconned first and die because of it. The Razvedka also typically beat the SPW 231 and 233 to the city, and because of this saved a lot of my push from that same recon vehicle just absolutely demolishing my infantry. The ZIS-2, as always, performed admirably, however I wish it had the same stealth rating as some of the other 57mm guns. If it does, I fail to see it, as this unit is almost always spotted, whereas I use units like the M1 or the 6-pound gun, both 57mm guns, and they're constantly practically invisible against Germans, while the ZIS-2 is spotted almost immediately each time it fires, or sometimes just by sitting there against the edge of a forest. This could just be a flawed perception thing, as I've only ever used the ZIS-2 and been disappointed by it in decks that get it, and so maybe that's it, but to that same end, I feel like they could use a stealth boost just to match those other units. For the love of God, I want to love the ISU-152. Every single deck that gets access to one of these things, I bring it in, and I think this will be the time that I use it. I think the tank looks lovely. I think it has excellent stats, aside from its terrible accuracy. This thing sports a base 20-second reload time. On top of that, it never hits anything and does not have a substantial amount of penetration. The one area where it really shines is the amount of damage it's able to do with either its HE or with its AP shell upon penetration or upon striking enemy infantry squads. Being that it does 12 damage, if you get the miracle shot that actually penetrates a King Tiger, you'll kill it right there, rather than penetrating it, doing some damage, and then waiting for another unit to kill it, as you're liable to see with a lot of the 88s present in German divisions. All in all though, for 120 points, I would like to see the ISU 152 perform a little bit better, or failing that, be reduced in price and perhaps raised in availability. The unit is slow, cumbersome, doesn't reload quickly, doesn't hit anything almost ever, and doesn't sport a reasonable amount of armor in order to compensate for that. Sure, its armor is more than sufficient to tank shots from a Panzer IV forever, but if it's engaged with anything heavier than that, more than likely it's going to just kill it. In the artillery tab, I found that the 37mm were excellent just because they never got counter-batteried. They're all attached to the WLA motorbike, and so they just kind of roll away after they get done shooting if you micro them properly, and thus avoid counter-battery intelligently. On top of this, for whatever reason, I find the F-22, and I know I've stated this before, is an excellent counter-battery piece regardless of its lack of a radio or lack of any heavy caliber munitions. It is perhaps because of these lack of heavy caliber munitions that it is so accurate over range, and I find that if you set these guys on counter battery or actually micromanage them to attack enemy battery, you come out with a lot more kills than you would otherwise see on heavier caliber guns. As I said when showing the first iteration of this deck, the Yak-1B Normandy at 2 stars, still coming in at 3 per card, is kind of the hero unit of this division. I don't know that there's any other unit in the game that comes in Phase A at a Force 2-star veterancy and still retains 3 per card, and because of that, these units are really special. Past that, the PE2s performed exactly as I thought they would, in that enough of them eventually bombed things that I didn't like into a fine powder, and that was it. I would say that bombers still come in at way too many per card in almost every deck they're available in, but that's neither here nor there and does not add or detract from this deck as a whole. All in all, I would put this deck as a very difficult one to play as a newer player in a team game scenario. In a 1v1, I think that this deck is excellent, as the T-3485 being 90 points is going to really outperform most enemy vehicles at around the same price point. In team games, however, where you're likely to see a smaller, more concentrated front against people who are overlapping and sometimes double teaming you, the T-3485 struggles quite a lot against those sort of scenarios. Heavy German vehicles, or even the Panther, will just tear this thing to shreds if you're not being very, very careful and micromanaging them very, very much, and so it becomes very difficult to play as a newer player. Add on top of that the OBR 1944 is most effective when being micromanaged to fire toggle the APCR and the AP to double its fire rate, and you get kind of a very difficult deck to play properly as a newer player. Couple this with the lack of real usability from your otherwise cheap units such as the Guardia, who are excellent in numbers, however don't really perform great by themselves, and you're just going to have a rough time if this is your first experience in Steel Division 2 with an allied division. I feel that this division is very well rounded and such is much better the fewer players there are in a game, with 1v1s being its strongest and 10v10s being potentially its weakest. That isn't to say that this deck can't perform well in those scenarios or can't perform poorly in 1v1s, but I just feel that that's where it's strongest. Moving on, we have 352nd Infantry, and another one of my favorite Axis divisions in the game. Jumping right into the Recon tab, I bring in the SPW-204F CDM, as this is the only one that comes with the HE shells as well as the AP shells, and I really just want these to be multi-role sort of support tanks, as it were. They're excellent for that. At 25 points, I couldn't think of a better unit to bring in this tab, and these just really, really perform at that 25 point level and oftentimes exceed it. In the Infantry tab, I bring in a Phase A card of No Star Grenadier, a Phase A Pioneer Führer, a Phase B card of Ersatztruppen, Phase B card of 2-star Stostrup, a Phase B card of Volksdeutsch, coming in at no stars, a Phase B card of Grenadierführer, and 2 Phase C cards of Grenadier, both at 1 star. The random upvetting came because the first time I had built this division, I had done it typically with as much no star as possible and found that I had 140 units of infantry in this division and immediately laughed and toned that down by upvetting as many as I could. While this is a strictly infantry division with support units, I don't feel like any deck needs more than 100 units of infantry, and I still exceeded that even after upvetting quite a few of them. In the tank tab, I brought in the Panzer B2F, the captured French tank, as well as the Stug 3G in Phase A. The Panzer B2 was brought in this phase because it's forced to come in Phase A, and the Stug 3 was brought in this phase because I just didn't think about it. Quick note about the Panzer B2, this unit is excellent and it took me a long time to come around on it. It's very slow and not very armored, not very penetrative, not very great if you just look at the sum of its stats. However, where it excels is the fact that it's a 40-point vehicle that features 2 guns that can independently fire at vehicles or at enemy infantry, while also sporting a machine gun. This is an excellent support vehicle and should be used in almost every infantry engagement that you can fit it into. In the support tab, I have a Phase A card of the Flammenwerfer coming in the motorbikes, a Phase A card of Commandant, Phase B supply truck, and a Phase B card of the IG-33s. The IG-33s are just great, and I love them as infantry support weapons, and below 800 meters they also sport heat shells that can really do a lot of damage to heavier tanks. In the anti-tank tab, I bring in a Phase A card of Panzerschreck in the motorbike. Would have brought more, however, this is the only card available to them. I brought in a Phase A card of the Pak 38 50mm, a Phase A card of the Pak 40 75mm, and a Phase A card of the Panther. I've made a trillion videos on this in the past, but if you're playing a super heavy division, of which I classified the Panther division, and you do not bring in a Panther in Phase A or a King Tiger or an IS-2 or whatever you might have in Phase A, then you're throwing the game effectively. Yes, I know that you can survive until Phase C, and then you can bring in 8 Panthers or 8 King Tigers or 12 in the newest 16th division. However, because you can do that does not mean that that is the ideal way to do it. Sure, there's something intrinsically valuable about the spam of 8 King Tigers suddenly showing up on the map come Phase C, but until then you're absolutely screwed if 21st wasn't otherwise broken. But I digress. In Phase B, I bring in a card of the Pak 43 41 88mm, and in Phase C, I bring in another card of Panthers, just to round out that end game. In the AA tab, I bring in the Flakwerlung in Phase A Phase B card of the Flak 41 88mm, and a Flakwerlung in Phase C. You really don't need much else when it comes to AA. This division has it all. The stationary Flakwerlungs are so much tankier than the SDKF Z71s, if a little bit slower because they're stationary, and the Flak 41 is more than enough to stun out enemy aircraft that's on its way in, or be a dual-purpose gun to take out enemy tanks. In the artillery tab, I bring in a Phase A card of the 105s. As I've said before, I've kind of fallen in love with these, and that hasn't changed, and a Phase A card of 380mm off-map observers all together now to get that early foothold. In Phase B, the latest phase that I could bring them in, I brought in 2 cards of the 155mm howitzers, both coming in the supply trucks, and these guys are just fantastic. They're absolutely excellent radio-guided artillery that slams into infantry with reckless abandon and counter batteries with ease. In Phase C, to round out my command structure, I brought in a battery Führer. In the air tab, I brought in an Me-109G TAC-6 at 2 stars in Phase A, 2 coming in per card at 2 stars. This is really the week for great ASF coming in at 2 stars in Phase A, and these really did not let me down. In Phase B, I brought in a card of the Me-109G TAC-2 R1s, the fighter-bomber variant. In Phase C, I brought in 3 different cards of Ju-188s, and honestly, I don't know what I was using these for. I kind of had a lot of them, and I have something of bomber PTSD where I feel I need them at all times in case I need to bomb a King Tiger to death. However, I was on the same side as the King Tiger, so I'm not entirely positive what my thought process was here. However, the Ju-188 is just an excellent plane. Come the end of the week, we didn't see many changes. One of the changes that I feel quite strongly about is in the infantry tab. I had practically nothing coming in Phase A, even though this is an infantry division. I found that I would use all 9 of my Grenadier and then sit there wondering what the hell I was going to do for the rest of the phase. I solved this by bringing the card of Volkdeutsch from Phase B into Phase A, and that really sorted everything out. The Volkdeutsche are 5 points more than the Ersatztruppen and as such are intrinsically less value to me. However, they do sport an LG-42 and they also have their little Panzerfaust, so they are, I guess, worth the extra 5 points. If I still feel poorly about them, that's on me, not really on them. In the tank tab, I moved the Stug 3G from Phase A to Phase B as I finally figured out that I could do so by looking at it long and hard. Otherwise, I dropped the card of ASF that I felt really strongly about and brought in the HS-129 BTAC-3, and while this did help me with dealing with heavier tanks in Phase A that I otherwise couldn't, I really did miss the ASF, and I think I would revert this change or perhaps drop one of the cards of the JE-188s instead. In case you're wondering why the HS-129 when I already have Jagdpanthers and PaK-43s, it's because the IS-2 1944 is kind of a beast and will shrug off shots from the Jagdpanther at 2 kilometers most of the time, while still being able to penetrate the Jagdpanther. And I only had experienced this for one game, but the 1944 really does a number to the Jagdpanther and left some scarring on my brain that caused me to bring in this HS-129 to force a multi-front engagement onto that IS-2. Other than that, this division was actually a lot of fun to play, and as opposed to Second Guard, I would say it's very easy for a newer player to get a handle on. The Jagdpanther does almost exactly what you'd think it would do. It's an anti-tank device that kills tanks. It kills them very efficiently, in fact, and has enough armor to shrug off most any enemy hit that isn't coming from an IS-2. The infantry tab sporting so many disheartened units, as well as so many great units to intersperse throughout that, is just a godsend among infantry tabs, and couple that with the Panzer B2 and you have a really dangerous infantry complement. The anti-tank tab of this division is such that you never are at a loss for things to bring in to battle enemy vehicles, no matter what those vehicles may be. If you're getting rushed down by T-34-76s or MCHs, for example, the PaK-40 and PaK-38 will make short work of them while being supported by the Jagdpanther. If you're fighting something heavier, then the PaK-43 and the Jagdpanther will be able to take care of it. So this is really a catch-all of an anti-tank tab and just really shines in this division. Couple all of that with the artillery tab being very, very decent, with the 155s hitting much smaller targets than I think should be possible. After all that is said and done, the JE-188s will clean up anything that those units were incapable of doing themselves. Something that I really enjoy about this division that isn't really present in a lot of other divisions is the stationary Flakwerlung 20mm anti-aircraft guns. These things are just awesome, and they're a lot less squishy being that they're not in their tank or half-track chassis that they're present in a lot of other decks in, say in the Wirbelwind or the SDKFZ-71. While they are a bit slower and don't keep up with your armored pushes as well, you're not making a lot of armored pushes in this division. The Jagdpanther is really your heaviest vehicle, and being that it's hull locked and sports an awful side armor, you don't want to push this out too far without first covering a lot of ground, and so these really work to your advantage. In almost direct opposition to the Second Guard division that I played on Allied side, this deck excels at open ground. If you get a nice open field with this division, I'd say that there are very few divisions that are going to really challenge you in that area. Even the IS-2 1944, which is quite a beast if it's 1v1ing the Jagdpanther, can't really push into this division as it oftentimes has multiple angles of fire of PaK-43s, Jagdpanthers, and PaK-40s just kind of bearing down on it. That isn't to say that its usability stops at open fields though, as this excels at mid-ranged engagements in forests or close-ranged engagements in cities. However, each facet of this deck functions very differently in each of those roles. I think that as a whole, you should never bring a Jagdpanther into anything closer than a long-ranged engagement, as it currently has the most penetration found on any weapon in the game, the same as the PaK-43 or King Tiger. However, it does not have the same armor as you're experienced to having on the King Tiger or the Ferdinand, so you kind of want to hold back with these guys and push sparingly as much as possible while still putting pressure on the enemy units with your Stugs and your infantry. As I've said already, I think that this is an excellent division to learn how to play the Axis side with. The Stug 3 is every bit an excellent vehicle, and being that it also has excellent infantry, excellent anti-aircraft potential, excellent artillery, and excellent aircraft, and let's not even talk about its outstanding anti-tank tab, It's likely to ease you into the sort of minutia of micromanaging in Steel Division 2 without having to worry too much about your Panther blowing up for no reason, as it's nearly invulnerable to most enemy units. At the same time, I think that this deck is actually very well balanced. The Panther, while invulnerable to most light and medium tanks that you're liable to see on the opposing side, is still very vulnerable to specific strategies employed by the Russians, such as bombing it to death, using cluster munitions, IS-2 1944s, or just ignore the alley of approach that it's currently watching, as it's almost incapable of repositioning once it's in a spot, and certainly cannot reposition quickly. All of these things sort of add up to make this one of my favorite divisions in the game, and it's really no wonder. It doesn't rely on any one thing too much other than the anti-tank tab, and the anti-tank tab I feel is not overpowered in any way, just very good. On top of all this, the Panther is beautiful. It's just a gorgeous unit design, and I just really enjoy playing with it. Either way, that is going to do it for this week in review on 352nd Infantry and 2nd Guard Tankovy. Thank you again for Flick17's suggestion for these two divisions. When I get back from vacation, I'm going to jump right into my video reviewing 358th Strokovy and 4th Munty. A small apology is due because during this week, because of all the craziness going on around the holiday, I won't be able to get any other videos uploaded other than these week in review videos, but rest assured that there are more gameplay videos on the way. I'm just incapable of editing them right now with the end of the semester for school, as well as vacations impending. So apologies for that, but I hope you've learned something, and I hope you have an excellent day.